Max Verstappen just exposed something that could shake the entire 2026 era, before the first race has even started. During preseason testing, cars were hitting 360 km per hour on the straight. But here is the terrifying part. If the battery runs out at the wrong moment, that same car suddenly drops to around 300. Now imagine another car behind it, full deployment activated, closing in at a 60 km per hour speed difference. 60. Into a braking zone. At full speed. Verstappen says this is not racing anymore. He says drivers are being forced to calculate battery percentages like accountants instead of attacking like racers. And if that continues, he has openly hinted he might not stay in the sport long term. The FIA says there is no panic. But they already have an emergency backup plan ready if Australia turns into chaos. Active aero fail-safes. Deployment limits. Geofencing systems. All installed before race 1. So the question is simple. Did the 2026 cars just create the most dangerous speed delta in modern Formula 1 history? Or is this the innovation that will redefine the sport? Stay with me, because what Verstappen revealed after testing could force the FIA into the biggest decision of this new era. Now that preseason testing is over, the masks are off. The numbers are real. And what the drivers experienced in Bahrain was not a small adjustment. It was a fundamental shift in how these 2026 cars behave at maximum speed. Let's break down exactly what Verstappen is pointing at. Under the new regulations, electrical deployment plays a much larger role than before. The internal combustion engine produces less peak output, while the electric motor now delivers massive bursts of torque, especially on corner exit and along long straights. On paper, that sounds exciting. More acceleration. More overtaking tools. More strategy. But the problem appears when that energy runs out. Because once the battery hits its deployment limit, the car does not gently taper off in speed. It drops. And it drops hard. During testing simulations, engineers observed scenarios where a leading car, managing energy aggressively, would reach the final section of a straight at around 290 to 300 km per hour. Meanwhile, a chasing car with full battery and the manual override system activated could be traveling at 350 to 360 km per hour. That is a 60 km per hour closing speed. Into a braking zone. Now imagine that difference in a place like Melbourne's Turn 1, or Jeddah's blind high-speed entries. Reaction time shrinks dramatically. The car behind has less than a second to judge whether the car in front is slowing due to braking, or simply because the battery has clipped. That uncertainty is what Verstappen calls artificial danger. He argues that drivers are now forced to think constantly about delta speed, about energy percentages, about whether attacking for 2 laps means sacrificing 3. He described it as doing mathematics at 360 km per hour. And here is the deeper concern. This is not just about overtaking. It is about predictability. Racing has always involved risk. But traditionally, that risk was linear. If you braked later, you accepted the consequence. If you defended aggressively, you calculated the move. Now, the risk is partially invisible. You cannot immediately see how much battery the car ahead has left. You cannot instantly judge whether it will lose 30, 40, or 60 km per hour before the braking zone. And that unpredictability increases tension in a way that feels uncomfortable even for elite drivers. The FIA responded after Bahrain with multiple safety adjustments. They introduced automatic fail-safe systems so that if active aero fails, the wings default to high downforce mode. They implemented geofencing, so low-drag configurations cannot remain active in dangerous zones. They restricted certain uses of deployment at race starts. All of these measures show something important. The governing body recognizes the risk. But at the same time, they publicly insist that there will be no major regulatory changes before Australia. That contradiction is what creates the sense of urgency. On one side, innovation. On the other, stability. And right in the middle, drivers like Verstappen raising red flags. Now add another layer. Braking. With the heavier reliance on regenerative braking, mechanical brake components are smaller than before. If regeneration fails because the battery is full or overheated, the car relies more heavily on physical brake discs that were not designed to handle the full deceleration load alone. That means the margin for error shrinks even further. One failure in energy recovery at the end of a 360 km per hour straight, and the driver becomes a passenger. That is not exaggeration. That is physics. So when Verstappen speaks out, it is not just frustration. It is a warning. He has already achieved titles. He does not need to prove anything. If he says the sport feels more like battery management than racing, people listen. And this is where it becomes a genuine challenge for the FIA. Because if the biggest star of the current era openly questions the philosophy of the new regulations, the debate expands beyond safety. It becomes about identity. What is Formula One supposed to be? A sustainability-driven technological experiment? Or a pure racing spectacle? Testing has ended. The data is locked. Australia will be the first true stress test. And if the delta speed issue becomes visible on live television, under real race conditions, the pressure will intensify immediately. Because innovation is exciting. But when innovation creates 60 km/h closing speeds into a braking zone, excitement quickly turns into concern. And that is the reality Verstappen has just placed in front of the FIA. The next race will not just award points. It will test whether this new generation is ready for real competition, or whether the sport must adjust before something forces it to. And here is where the situation becomes even more complex. Because this is not just a technical debate. It is political. The FIA has publicly committed to the 2026 vision. Smaller cars, lighter chassis, more electrical power, sustainable fuel, active aerodynamics designed to reduce drag on straights and increase efficiency. Reversing that direction before the first race would signal instability. But ignoring the concerns could signal stubbornness. And that balance is delicate. During the emergency meeting in Sakir, the official message was calm. No panic. No major changes before Australia. The evidence, they said, is still immature. Yet behind the scenes, contingency plans were prepared. A potential reduction in maximum electrical deployment during races if the opening event exposes dangerous speed deltas. That alone tells you the governing body is not entirely comfortable. Because if everything were fully under control, there would be no need for a backup patch. Now consider the broader impact. If the FIA reduces deployment mid-season, it changes competitive balance instantly. Teams that optimized around aggressive battery usage would lose an advantage. Teams that struggled with energy mapping might suddenly benefit. That is not a small adjustment. That is a philosophical shift. And drivers know it. Verstappen's criticism is not just about speed difference. It is about rhythm. He has built his driving style around attack, late braking, aggressive corner entry, momentum. Now he is being asked to lift early to harvest energy, to downshift strategically to recharge, to avoid deploying too much too soon. That changes the psychological flow of a lap. Instead of pure racing instinct, it becomes calculated conservation. He described it as anti-racing. And when someone of his stature uses that phrase, it echoes. There is also the visibility factor. Fans can see overtakes. Fans can see crashes. But they cannot easily see battery percentage. They cannot see when a driver is forced to lift because of energy management. If the spectacle begins to look artificial, with cars blasting past each other on straights due purely to deployment advantage, the authenticity of competition becomes part of the debate. And that is dangerous territory for Formula One. Because the sport thrives on perceived fairness and raw competition, not on algorithmic speed bursts. Now add the contract dimension. Verstappen has an exit window for 2027 if performance drops or conditions become unsatisfactory. He has openly stated he does not need to remain in the sport if he no longer enjoys the driving experience. That is leverage. Real leverage. If the most marketable driver of this era signals discomfort with the direction of the rules, sponsors notice. Teams notice. Broadcasters notice. And suddenly, the FIA's regulatory philosophy becomes a public conversation. Australia will be decisive. Not because of who wins, but because of how the race unfolds. If we see cars dramatically slowing at the end of straights due to battery clipping, if we see awkward overtakes created purely by override activation, if we see instability when active aero transitions between modes, the debate will intensify instantly. If, however, the race flows smoothly and the delta speed remains manageable, the FIA gains breathing room. That is why this moment matters so much. Testing provided controlled evidence. But racing introduces chaos, dirty air, unexpected safety cars, mixed tire strategies, real overtaking pressure. And in that environment, the 60 km/h differential becomes more than a theoretical risk. It becomes a variable that drivers must manage under stress. So the next block of this story is simple. The lights will go out in Melbourne. And we will finally see whether Verstappen's warning was a dramatic overreaction, or an early alert that the 2026 generation pushed the balance between innovation and safety too far. Because once the cars reach 360 km/h in real traffic, there is no simulation. There is only reality. And reality decides everything. And this is where everything tightens. Because once the first race begins, theory disappears. There are no more controlled test programs. No more carefully planned deployment patterns. No more space to experiment quietly. Now it becomes instinct versus system. Driver versus algorithm. At 360 kilometers per hour. Imagine the opening laps in Melbourne. Full fuel, cold tires, 20 cars packed together. Under the new regulations, the active aero system is restricted at the start to prevent chaos. But once the field spreads and drivers begin activating override on the straights, the energy chess game starts immediately. One driver deploys aggressively to attack. Another lifts early to conserve. A third runs neutral, hoping to balance both. Within 5 laps, battery levels diverge. And that is when unpredictability increases. The car ahead might suddenly lose 30, 40, even 60 kilometers per hour compared to the car behind. In clear air, maybe that is manageable. In dirty air, with turbulent flow and shifting braking points, it becomes far more complex. Now add lateral wind. With the new low-drag philosophy, cars feel lighter in high-speed straight-line sections. Drivers reported the steering becoming nervous at top speed during testing. A small crosswind can move the car meter sideways. At 360 kilometers per hour, that movement is not subtle. It is violent. So now imagine this. Car A runs low battery, slows to around 300. Car B approaches at 360. A gust of wind shifts car A slightly offline. Car B commits to the inside, expecting a predictable braking point. But the braking phase is already compromised because regenerative braking depends on battery state. If regeneration is reduced or fails, mechanical braking alone must absorb the deceleration load. That is a perfect storm. Speed differential, reduced aerodynamic load, heavy braking reliance, and human reaction under pressure. This is what Verstappen is pointing at. He is not saying innovation is wrong. He is saying the margin between performance and risk has narrowed dramatically. And here is the uncomfortable part for the FIA. If nothing happens in Australia, they can defend the regulations confidently. If something almost happens, if there is even a near miss caused by extreme delta speed, the narrative explodes. Because viewers can see speed. They can see a car blasting past another like it belongs to a different category. And they will ask the same question. Is this racing? Or is this software-assisted overtaking? The governing body believes the long-term vision will stabilize once teams refine energy mapping. They argue that drivers always complain during regulatory shifts. That happened in 2014 with hybrid engines. That happened when the Halo was introduced. But the difference here is the speed gap dynamic. 60 kilometers per hour difference between two cars sharing the same braking zone is not just uncomfortable. It is measurable risk. And that risk becomes magnified at circuits with long straights and heavy braking zones. Jeddah, Baku, Monza. If Melbourne exposes even a fraction of instability, the pressure for mid-season intervention will rise. And intervention creates another problem. Fairness. If deployment limits are reduced after race 1, teams that optimized aggressively lose advantage. Championship momentum shifts artificially. That is why this moment is so delicate. The FIA must protect safety without undermining competitive integrity. And Verstappen's words have amplified that tension. He has hinted that enjoyment matters. That racing purity matters. And that he does not need to stay if the experience feels artificial. That statement alone raises stakes beyond lap time. Because if the sport loses drivers of his caliber over regulatory philosophy, the consequences go far beyond one season. So this next race is not just a competition. It is an evaluation of the delta speed concept, of active aero reliability, of regenerative braking dependency, of whether innovation has crossed into unpredictability. When the lights go out, we will not only be watching who leads into turn 1. We will be watching how the cars behave at the end of the longest straight, whether battery clipping looks manageable, whether closing speeds look safe, whether drivers trust what is happening beneath them. Because trust is everything at 360 kilometers per hour. And right now, that trust is being tested. For the drivers, for the teams, and for the FIA itself.